like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lucas Nathan is the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Division. His background is in fisheries management with experience conducting research on aquatic invasive species and genetic applications to fisheries conservation. In his current role, he collaborates with partners in the state and across the region to develop and implement the Fishery Division's statewide aquatic invasive species program. And Dr. Nathan's title of his presentation today is Michigan's Responses to New Zealand Mud Snails. And with that, I will hand over the screen to him. And thanks, Dr. Nathan.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. Thank you all for tuning in here today. With today's webinar, I'm hoping to provide an overview of both past and ongoing responses to New Zealand mud snail from a state perspective, but also providing some indication of where we're at with the ongoing responses and where we look to be moving into the future as we continue to think about strategies to address the threats from this invasive species. So before I get much further, I'm going to kill my video here for this talk, just out of the interest of bandwidth. And before I really get too much further, wanted to acknowledge all my co-authors here. So Seth Herbst from Michigan DNR, and Billy Kuiper and Sarah Lesage from EGLE. This really makes up our this state of Michigan-based team that has been leading a lot of the efforts and coordinating a lot of the ongoing efforts for New Zealand mud snail in Michigan. But in addition to our state of Michigan team, really what I'll be talking about here today is really thanks to a very broad and very numerous and diverse group of partners that have been involved in ongoing New Zealand mud snail work over the last several years. And I'm a pretty firm believer that a lot of our projects we do in our field, can't really be done, or perhaps can't be done as good as they could be without a very broad, extensive group. And invasive species certainly, I think, brings out that collaborative nature, arguably more than any other project. So it's always good to see these different groups come together, and I'll be acknowledging all the partners, throughout the talk here today, but just wanted to start up front and provide those acknowledgements for all the great partners that have been involved in this work. So for today, I just provide a brief outline here. I'll start just by giving a high-level overview or introduction to New Zealand mud snails. Obviously, with you participating in this webinar, I'm sure you already are somewhat familiar with the species, but just want to provide a quick background there, an introduction to the topic, and then spend a good deal of time talking about the history of the species here in Michigan and some of the early work to respond to New Zealand mud snails in Michigan, but then also look towards what are some ongoing responses and where are we going from here, and what are some of the remaining priorities to address the threats of New Zealand mud snails. So as that quick background, New Zealand mud snails are a worldwide invader. They can be spread through a couple different pathways, with shipping and angling being the primary mode of dispersion across different water bodies. And they're relatively unique in terms of an invasive species, given their ability to reproduce asexually, which obviously has some concerns because unlike some species that can be limited early on in their invasions by just low numbers, which can sometimes slow their progress to spread and increase in population sizes. This ability to reproduce asexually definitely gives them a leg up from an invasive species perspective, that a single individual can give rise to an entire population. And from an impacts perspective, the concern over New Zealand mud snails is that they can reach really high densities, particularly at localized scales, where you can sometimes see upwards of hundreds of thousands in a very small area along streams and rivers. And this is concerning because they have the potential to outcompete some of our native invertebrate species, and also because of the ability for them to pass through fish digestion systems, oftentimes undigested, indicates that they have a low level of nutritional value to some of our fish species. So if they can outcompete our native invertebrates that provide that important forage base for some of the higher taxonomic groups like fishes, they can outcompete those to remove a viable food source from some of those other organisms. From a management perspective, another concerning aspect is that we currently are lacking really effective open water eradication techniques. So there are some options for treating New Zealand mud snails in small, localized scales, oftentimes looking at in confined areas like hatcheries. However, when we're thinking about a natural river or stream treating any large population of New Zealand mud snail, it's a really challenging feat. And to date, we don't necessarily have one of those tools in our toolbox to achieve eradication. And from a US distribution perspective, I'm sure if you've seen New Zealand mud snail talks, you've likely seen this figure in the past. The first documented occurrence of mud snails was in the Snake River in Idaho in 1987. But since that time, they have rapidly spread with some of the more recent documentations occurring east of the Mississippi in the Great Lakes region in particular. Narrowing in a bit more into the state of Michigan, mud snails have been documented in the Great Lakes themselves, dating back to the 1990s. And based on some genetic analyses, these individuals most match with the European clones, so indicating that the mode of transportation or introduction into the Great Lakes was most likely from the shipping industry. So one of the benefits there of having these genetic clones is that we can attribute them to the source populations with a pretty high degree of accuracy. And this is in contrast to the recent inland documented infestations. The first one occurring in 2015 in the Pere Marquette River in Michigan. However, I'll also note that there's evidence of an earlier observation in 2013 in the Boardman River. However, that occurrence was not reported until 2016. But these inland infestations that are now being observed in Michigan are distinct from those in the Great Lakes in that they match the populations that we see in the western part of the US, which indicates that as opposed to the shipping industry being the likely mode of introduction, that it's likely the wading angling pathway. So we know that Michigan has some world-class inland fisheries, in particular our salmonid fisheries, and this draws people from outside the state, and this is most likely the source of introduction for some of these inland populations that we're now seeing. So with any new invader that we come across, there's always a wide range of responses that we can take. First and foremost, when we have a new species that's introduced, trying to eradicate them is typically goal number one. If we can get out ahead of them and eradicate them before they spread and become established in a larger geographic range, that's tend to be the primary goal. However, as I mentioned with New Zealand mud snails in particular, we're currently lacking that effective open water treatment option. And also with this species in particular, given where they have been located, during the early response efforts, there was concerns about the non-target impact, so impacting the communities that New Zealand mud snails are being found in. So early on, we did not decide to follow up with wide-scale treatments due to these factors, and instead look to emphasize other response strategies during the early phases of our response efforts. And this is what I'll be structuring some of the talk here on, is how we focused on increasing surveillance, trying to document where else our New Zealand mud snails might be present, trying to limit their spread from where they are currently documented, addressing uncertainties, which we know is always a key part of developing any successful response strategy. And we know that with new invasive species, there's always a lot of questions. Where are they? How can we detect them? How can we control them? How can we prevent them from moving around? So that's always a high priority within any new response effort that we might come across. And then finally, emphasizing the partnership aspect. I mentioned that right out of the gate with this talk here, that during the early phases of this response and to date and moving forward, partnerships have been a very high priority because it really increases the capacity to address some of these new response priorities and can bring together partners with varying expertises to help address some of these emerging invasive species issues. So one of the first efforts that was undertaken in the state was a project that was led by Michigan State University in collaboration with the state of Michigan. This was funded by a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative project with the goals of trying to quantify or evaluate different detection methods. So we know that with the new invasive species, we want to know where they're at, but in order to have confidence in our ability to detect and conduct surveillance work, we need to know that we're using the right tool for the job. So this is where the work done by Sam Tank, which if you tuned in, she actually was another presenter in this webinar series. So some of this is probably repeat information if you're able to catch her talk. But wanted to provide a high-level overview of that work because it has influenced our ongoing response work. So with her project, one of the questions we're looking to address was this idea of detection methods. And one of the techniques they used was a visual survey approach. And the strategy here being to have multiple independent searchers using an aqua viewer, which you can see being demonstrated here in this top photo, and having multiple searchers spread out through a river, as you can see in this bottom image, and using that information and through repeated surveys, we can use those data to help estimate detection probability. And they used an occupancy framework to accomplish this, which is just a analytical method which uses repeat sampling to say, okay, if we know something is here and we repeat the survey multiple times, we know that if it was detected there, then in theory we should be detecting it with every survey. And if not, that influences our detection probability. In addition to that approach, there was also some eDNA testing to see how it might compare to some of these visual surveys. So as opposed to identifying them by sight, we can take a water sample and potentially detect the presence of mud snails using genetic techniques. And there's also of that work were very encouraging in that the visual survey found that across the board, we had about an 80% or greater percent probability of detecting mud snails with that visual survey in a single searcher, if in fact the mud snails were present. And we increase that to 2 searchers, that probability jumps then to over 96%. And this is encouraging, obviously. We want a higher detection probability, but being able to achieve that with a relatively straightforward sampling protocol of using these aqua viewers gives a lot of increased confidence moving forward that we can deploy this technique at broader spatial scales and have a reasonably good chance of detecting mud snails if in fact they're present. Also, as part of that work, I mentioned the eDNA component. They did find that the eDNA was able to detect mud snails, which is also really encouraging. You can detect a species just by scooping up a sample of water. They did document some potential inhibition issues. So this has been a case with some different mussel species as well, that you can have other, chemicals in the water that influences the ability to reliably detect them. So just something to consider moving forward with the use of eDNA techniques. And oftentimes with eDNA, it's beneficial to pair them with visual surveys. So we can use eDNA as maybe a coarse filter to sample a larger section of a stream or river, and then do follow-up surveys with this visual survey to actually pinpoint where exactly mud snails might be present in any given stretch. So armed now with this information about how can we detect mud snails if they're present, another part of that project and some of the efforts that have been going on at the state level is to document the distribution of mud snails at a statewide scale. So this map here shows a summary of the efforts that have been implemented since 2015. So it's really going back to that first observation. We had response efforts by DNR staff, EGLE staff, and the Michigan State University project that Sam was leading was a big part of it as well, and accomplished a lot of these surveys across the state. And you can see based on the map, we've had a lot of efforts distributed across much of the state of Michigan, and to date, we've detected mud snails in 5 rivers. You can see that there's some asterisks and clarifications there, one being the Boardman detection, as I mentioned. The year was first detected in 2016, but there was also an observation in 2013 that wasn't reported until later. Additionally, there's an asterisk there on the Pine River, and that to my knowledge, there was a single detection in 2017 that has not had an additional detection since that date. So I think there's still some questions regarding the status of that population. So that's where we have with a distribution perspective. One of the other priorities that we have across the state is obviously to prevent the spread. So without a viable eradication strategy, preventing the spread is arguably the top priority to prevent them from being spread and introduced and established in additional water bodies. And we've taken a number of different strategies in the past. First and foremost is through a large-scale media outreach effort, which occurred shortly after those first inland documented cases occurred back in 2015. And then also some additional targeted work looking at developing these very eye-catching signs that were built by the state and with partners, and also deployed wader washing stations at several locations where wading anglers might be entering water bodies and moving back and forth between different locations and have the potential to spread. So these are some strategies that have been used in the past to increase awareness and encourage anglers to be very careful about moving the species around, and encourage them to clean their gear and decontaminate their gear in between fishing locations. Some of the other preventative type efforts that have occurred, we have our state of Michigan decontamination policy, which has been in effect since 2014, and this goes across the state agencies. We use this protocol across both aquatic and terrestrial applications to try to limit the spread, not just of mud snails, but of other potential invasive species as well. Some of the other work that's been going on into the preventative type priority, you might recognize Jeremy here. He's been involved with Scott Teagues at Oakland University into researching the effectiveness of the different decontamination strategies, and developed a number of really great videos to help communicate not only the concerns about mud snails, but what are the best strategies for cleaning your gear to prevent their spread from moving from water body to water body. One of the other aspects, though, that is a concern regarding mud snails and preventative actions is we know that it's not just about communicating this information to anglers. So this is another part of the work that Sam had provided in a previous webinar in this series, and one that certainly highlights one of the concerns we have with this issue right now. So there's to walk through this figure here. Some of Sam's work was looking at surveying anglers about their knowledge of New Zealand mud snails, and also the percent of anglers that take action to decontaminate their gear. So within this figure here, we can see that there's a breakdown of anglers that are aware of New Zealand mud snails on the left-hand side, and those that are unaware on the right-hand side. So you can see a roughly 50-50 split, which is encouraging that, half or a little more than half of anglers were aware of the New Zealand mud snail issue. The concerning part, though, is that if we look at the breakdown between those that take the necessary decontamination actions versus those that don't, we again see about a 50-50 split. And that 50-50 split is concerning, that there's this subsection of anglers that are aware of New Zealand mud snail issues, but aren't necessarily taking the next steps to try to prevent the spread of this type of aquatic invasive species. So the reason this being concerning is that there seems to be this disconnect between awareness and decontamination actions. And that's certainly a problem, not just with the New Zealand mud snail issue in particular, but really aquatic invasive species as a whole. I would argue that there are multiple opportunities for anglers and boaters and the public to take some of these steps to help reduce the spread. But there is that disconnect between knowledge and action. And so I'll sort of put a pin in that for now and circle back around to it as we start talking about some of the other efforts that are ongoing now. But one of the last things I wanted to mention regarding prevention was some of the work that's been done in the past focused on hatcheries. So I've mentioned in passing that fish in particular can digest mud snails and expel them oftentimes unharmed, which can lead to fish themselves acting as a vector for spread of New Zealand mud snail. So some of the efforts that have been going on to try to target this include hatchery surveillance, so visual inspections at some of the state and privately owned hatcheries across the state, and also some of the surveillance work that was led by Michigan State as part of their project targeted some of these stretches of river upstream and downstream, some of the hatcheries that are drawing from surface waters as part of their hatchery practices to try to get a sense of, are the hatcheries in some way contributing to the New Zealand mud snail spread. And as part of that, we've developed a biosecurity plan, which is regulated through our stocking regulations, that if any hatcheries are contaminated with mud snails, then they have to follow a number of biosecurity steps, including how the water is sourced, the fish purging process, which involves feeding within hatchery facilities, the fish handling practices, whether the fish are netted out of the truck versus just dumped, and then is water dumped directly into the receiving water bodies, or does water have to be dumped elsewhere? So there's a number of steps within that plan to try to minimize those risks of hatcheries acting as a vector for mud snail spread. So at a very high level, that is some of the summaries of some of the past work that has been going on focused on mud snails across the state, but there's also a whole bunch of work that is still ongoing. So this is somewhat of a pivot point here, talking about some of the work that is still ongoing, and also starting to get into more of the where are we going with mud snail efforts across the state. So with that, so the second half here, the outline involves some of the surveillance and monitoring work that continues to date, and also some additional work focused on this behavior change or breaking down that disconnect between angler awareness and action. And then finally, a survey that was recently conducted to try to get a sense of perceptions of mud snails and the ongoing efforts focused on mud snails, and what are some of the lessons learned by managers and researchers across the country that have been dealing with this issue. In some cases, longer periods of time than we have here in Michigan. So from a surveillance and monitoring perspective, at least from some of the state-specific efforts, our strategy towards conducting additional field work focused on them, we've been tapping into some of the existing capacity that we have within our state programs. So for instance, within Fish Division of the DNR, we have a status and trends program that targets streams and rivers across the state. And as part of that, they've adopted a New Zealand mud snail specific protocol, which is based off of Sam Tank's study. So it's those visual surveys with multiple independent searchers. And this work covers rough 30 to 40 or so streams and rivers across the state, and has a randomization process to it. So it ends up covering a pretty wide geographic range. And this program did help contribute to finding that Manistee River detection in the upper Manistee. Additionally, Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, has their surface water assessment program. So it's the P51 bioassessments. And that's actually what the figure is here. They cover about 150 to 250 sites annually, which you can see covers a whole lot of water across the state. And although this protocol isn't necessarily mud snail specific, it does have a macroinvertebrate assessment protocol that would certainly have a really good chance of detecting mud snails if in fact they're present in these locations. So at least from a state perspective, we have some of these ongoing programs that we've tapped into to try to increase the capacity to conduct some of the mud snail work across the state. But certainly, as I've emphasized throughout, the partnerships through the Great Lakes New Zealand Mud Snail Collaborative and Oakland University and Trent Unlimited and all of our SISMAs also are contributing greatly to continuing to increase the capacity moving forward to conduct some of these mud snail specific efforts. And in particular, Oakland University and Scott Teague's on, and Jeremy as well, I mentioned some of the work that they've been doing with the decontamination methods. That's just a one piece of a very large project that they've been working on, and this was a project funded by the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program. There's also looking at tapping into citizen science efforts to increase some of these early detection efforts, which certainly, again, speaks to that partnership aspect, that getting additional support from from citizen scientists certainly is one way to really increase the capacity to have additional eyes out in the field. Also, some of the work that they've been leading is assessing the population trends and the impacts in certain areas, in particular places like the Au Sable, which I'll mention here in subsequent slides. That monitoring aspect and documenting the impacts is certainly a high priority moving forward with mud snails in the state. And also the fish diet work that I've been mentioning about evaluating the role that mud snails play in fish diets. The Oakland University, so Scott and Jeremy have been leading that work, has just been really important for, again, helping to get a better understanding of what the species in particular might be impacting some of our fish species and how they're subsequently impacting the ecosystem. So in addition to surveillance and monitoring, the behavior study that I briefly mentioned is a newer project, and this is reviewed as a follow-up to Sam Tank's project, which identified this disconnect between awareness and action. So this is another project that's funded by the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, with the high-level goal being to try to evaluate that disconnect, try to figure out, why might anglers be aware but not taking the action, and how can we try to close that gap? So how can we increase the percent of those that know they should be cleaning their gear into actually taking those steps to try to limit the spread of mud snails and other invasive species. So this is really early on in the project, but it is slated to increase some of the ongoing work this year. So the specific objectives of this work will be to expand some of Sam's work, looking at the angler survey, so expanding to multiple rivers across the state, and also look to replicate some of that survey work with boaters as well. So we know that the boating pathway has a lot of parallels to the wading anglers in terms of a potential for spreading invasive species. They have, obviously we have a lot of outreach focused on those groups, but we also know that not everyone is cleaning their boats when they're leaving a water body and heading over to another water body. So hopefully increasing the scope of those surveys will give us a more complete picture of this issue, the issue being the disconnect between awareness and action. As part of this work, they'll also be looking to observe and evaluate the angler behavior and boater behavior directly. So in addition to asking anglers and boaters about their work, I'll also be looking to observe them directly to see, are they taking the necessary steps? So are they more likely to wash their waders when they are in a wader station or a wader washing station is present? And this also then leads into the question of how do we develop more effective outreach? So can we strategically make outreach to target different messages to help improve the action that anglers and boaters might take? So this work is, I mentioned it's early on, it's going. It's being led by Dan Hayes and Joe Lattimore and Meredith Gore. And we're hoping to make progress on this one soon, and hopefully be able to close some of these gaps in terms of the awareness to action. And the final part about some of the ongoing work that I wanted to provide here today was a recent effort, which was led by the Great Lakes Museum Mudsnail Collaborative. So myself and my co-authors, Jeremy and Tim Campbell from Wisconsin Sea Grant have been heavily involved in this work. And we sought out to send a survey to US-based researchers and managers to try to get their sense of what are some of the ongoing strategies they're taking with mud snails, what are their perceptions about the effectiveness, and in general, what are some of the lessons learned that they've had in their experiences. In particular, thinking about some of the states out west that have been dealing with mud snails for a few decades, and certainly a longer period of time than we have here in inland Michigan. Can we learn something from their experiences that we could then apply to some of our ongoing efforts here in the state of Michigan to hopefully improve the overall effectiveness of our response strategies? So to give you an idea of what are some of the questions that we sought to ask as part of this survey, there were oftentimes a multi-part question, which were largely broken up by prevention and outreach and control and research efforts, where we would ask, for instance, on the prevention side of things, list the strategies that you've been using or your program or your jurisdiction has been using to prevent the spread of mud snails. And as subsequent follow-ups there, we would ask, how successful have these prevention strategies been at achieving the goal of preventing the spread, and then provide additional justification. So we look to try to use a combination of more multiple kind of multi-choice type responses and open-ended questions to allow them to provide as much feedback as possible to describe some of their experiences. So we distributed this survey last summer, received 22 different responses, and I'll admit here, these are still relatively speaking pretty hot off the press. We're still working through some of the analyses. So most of what I'll provide from this point forward is largely preliminary, but nevertheless wanted to provide some of the major take homes that we've been seeing so far, looking at some of these responses. So as a quick summary of where do we get these responses from, or where are the folks based at? It's a mix, but largely follows the distribution of mud snails. So we had a lot of responses from the Great Lakes region in particular. So getting input from the folks in the Great Lakes has also been beneficial towards these questions. And then also from the Western region also contributed one of the highest response rates, which is really some of the input we were interested in, giving that those are some of the folks that have been dealing with mud snails for a longer period of time. And we also had some responses from the Mid-Atlantic region, Mississippi, and some that had some national affiliations as well. And from a affiliation perspective, we had a mix. So we range from state and federal agencies, tribal affiliations, universities, NGOs, and a few that didn't respond. But a good mix there that hopefully captured some of the broad perspectives that we might expect in our field with these different affiliations. And although we haven't broken down some of our responses by these different categories yet, that is certainly something that we'll look to do as we continue to dig into these analyses in a little greater detail. But for some high-level outcomes of what we're seeing, the questions about prevention is about what you'd expect. I think almost all of the respondents included some sort of outreach, and in particular stressed the outreach and signage specifically at the water body access sites. So this was to be expected, given we think that's the most targeted outreach that we could provide for this pathway in particular. Some other responses included more general pathway-based outreach approaches, so less species specific and more about the pathway as a whole. And then there was a number as well that also stressed the action-oriented steps, so not just outreach from a communication and information standpoint, but putting the tools into action. So the boot brush stations, looking at policy from policy perspective, the aquaculture containment type strategies, and those types of approaches were all included in some of the responses regarding prevention. When asked about who are they trying to target with some of these efforts, and specifically thinking about the outreach, it's what you'd expect. It's the users, the recreational users in these pathways. So wading anglers, fishing guides, fishing organizations, those that are out with quite literally boots on the ground and boots in the water that are potentially spreading these species. So no real surprises there. Well, where it starts to get interesting is when we ask questions about how successful have these prevention strategies been, or how successful have they been. And what I found was interesting is that we see somewhat of a bimodal distribution of sorts, where you do see a number that express that they're either extremely successful, or moderately successful, but then also a good number that suggested that they're unsure of how successful these strategies have been. This is certainly something interesting that we see sort of these perhaps two different clusters of responses. And when prompted then with the final follow-up question of, okay, give some additional insights to your response, we got what I saw as sort of three different categories of responses. One being that, effectiveness is largely based on spread. So we quantify how good we are at preventing spread based on, are they showing up in new water bodies? And those seem to be the ones that were indicating that that prevention efforts have been pretty successful, because they aren't seeing widespread new infestations showing up. So relatively contained spread seems to indicate that their efforts are pretty successful. However, others, these are typically associated with those that were unsure about whether these efforts were effective, or indicated that there has been very limited or no formal evaluation. So we're missing a rigorous approach, or we don't have the resources to do any kinds of follow-ups and truly track, are these preventative efforts doing what we intend them to do, which is prevent the spread of invasive species. And also a lot that just indicate that it's really hard. It's difficult to quantify at large spatial scales. It's hard to link the outreach efforts to actions. And that was another part that was stressed as part of this response, is that it's just a challenging thing to pin down. So I think in a nutshell, that it stresses some of the ongoing efforts that I mentioned, with the behavior change project being led by Dan Hayes et al. At MSU, trying to address some of these questions, is that it is challenging, and hopefully tapping into some of the more social science aspects, which I think is a really emerging field within aquatic invasive species, is trying to pinpoint, where can we make some gains and evaluate some of these preventative efforts. The other part of the survey results that I wanted to provide some overview to was based on the impacts. I mentioned early on that Scott and Jeremy and others that are working at Oakland University to address some of these impact type questions. I think this is another high priority area of research for mud snails. So asking the survey participants, based on your professional opinion, what are some of the perceived or realized impacts to the ecosystem or fisheries that you are most familiar with, that you're working with in your area. And we saw a wide range of responses, and I just sort of briefly summarize some of the snapshots of these responses here. And you see that there's a range from the impacts were spatially dependent, but challenging to quantify. There are some concerns about food web impacts, and certainly potential to modify the food webs, but stress the need for some research. And additional responses that indicated that there were some uncertainties, and also some that indicated that there was none, but lacking some research or no impact that they're aware of. And if I were to distill all that down into a nutshell, I would literally underscore here that just about every one of the responses indicated some degree of uncertainty. And I think to me that really highlights how important of a research area that this is in particular, to try to get a better sense of how mud snails are impacting some of our native ecosystems. And with that, sort of to wrap things up and summarize in a forward-leaning type way here, I think, at least from a state perspective, what we see as some of the highest priorities moving forward is continuing to conduct surveillance, to document any new infestations, and certainly document any spread that's occurring from some of the known infestations. So I mentioned all the ongoing work to target those efforts and documenting these new infestations as they show up. And the monitoring component of it, also a really high priority to determine how are these populations trending? Are they continuing to expand locally, both in spatial scale or relative abundance? And then the impacts. I think both here in the state, we recognize that as a high degree of uncertainty, and looking outside of the state and across the country based on some of those survey results, again, seems to underscore the need to quantify some of these impacts of mud snails onto our ecosystems. And then last, but certainly not least, I think the awareness and increasing decontamination actions is, I think it's not only extremely high priority for New Zealand mud snails, but looking across some of our other pathways for invasive species. That certainly remains a very challenging one to grapple with, and I think it will continue to be a challenge, but it's certainly a challenge worth trying to address to try to decrease the spread of some of these different invasive species and increase the necessary actions that the public and others can take to try to address some of these issues. And with that, I kind of end in the same way I started, which is providing all the credit where credit is due. Just about everything I mentioned here today has been the collaborative efforts of all the folks you see here and many others. So a big thanks to all of them, and certainly look forward to continuing to work with all the great partners that we've been working with here in the state into the future. And with that, I believe we still have some time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great presentation, Lucas. Thanks for very good information. Absolutely. Jasmine will read off any questions we might have that popped up throughout it.
Yep, got a few here. The first one is, you mentioned we have a European clone. Is there anything we can learn from Europe researchers and natural resource regulators on impact assessment, surveillance, and outreach?
That's a good question. Honestly, I think it's one that I'm personally not aware of some of those ongoing efforts. I think that you could see a tremendous value in sort of replicating that survey we did with the U.S. emphasis, and also look across the pond as well. To my knowledge, no one has done that, and I'll be honest, I'm not really on top of what efforts that they've been doing as well.
We have someone asking about angler decontamination kits, like brush giveaways or anything.
Just in general, the use of them.
Yeah, it just says, what about angler decon
Yeah,
kits?
this is Mac. You guys hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Lucas. So I had this idea for working with anglers. Actually, Tim has mentioned this too. I work out of Wisconsin driftless area, so a huge threat and opportunity here. I'd like to see if we could get buy-in with prompts. I know we often give away boot brush things like with a WDNR level. I'm wondering if there's been any research about the effectiveness of if we could make kits for anglers, recommend like a tackle box, like a decon tackle box, something like that we could promote, and if that would be effective, or if there's any study on that.
Yeah, I think that aligns closely with some of the work that Scott and others have been working on as well. Is how do we not only document the most effective techniques, but what are the ones that people are most likely to actually use? So tapping into, I think that those anglers and giving them something that's most likely to be implemented is definitely the way to go to try to increase the percentage of these anglers that are taking those actions. So yeah, I certainly think that's a good strategy forward.
Okay, thanks. Another question. Do you see any difference in the public's willingness to decontaminate boats and other recreational gear across different invasive species? Is there different levels of effort by the public?
For specific species, I'm not sure, but I think based on research that's been done, from a social science perspective, it would point to, when anglers or those that are involved in these pathways see the direct impact, you'd have a better chance of them taking the preventative action. So the species that they see impacting their water bodies directly, they're in theory more likely to take the actions to try to limit that spread. That being said, I'm not aware of any, current quantification of that difference in terms of the species that we're talking about in mudsnails in particular, but I'll point to that the new project led by Dan Hayes and others at Michigan State, which is hoping to try to expand some of those surveys beyond just the weighing anglers to also include boaters. And that would be one element of that project that I would hope might be able to address, how are boaters more likely than wading anglers, or are wading anglers in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula more likely to take the actions in the south, and see some of those differences play out across space.
Absolutely. Another question just popped up. How important is it to monitor creeks and tributaries that feed into rivers like the Boardman? If the river is already invaded, is it still important to monitor these versus other streams that feed into Lake Michigan, such as Grand Traverse Bay?
Yeah, I think the strategies surrounding surveillance and monitoring, you'd certainly want to be looking towards where might they show up in completely new tributaries that we're not currently aware of. So where are there fishing hotspots that they might show up, but then also looking at those immediately connected to see are they moving or expanding from the location that we currently know they're at, through more natural dispersal pathways, whether they be through fish or otherwise. They also give us a sense not just of their spread, but also, that population in particular, is it growing? Is the abundance changing over time? And those are, it kind of starts to get to that question of the monitoring and the long-term impacts of those populations. So I'd say yes to all from a strategy perspective, that those are, it's two pieces to a broader puzzle.
Great. Well, that is all the questions I have. If anybody else has any, feel free to speak up or type it into the chat, or get a hold of us after the webinar. Okay, well, nobody else, then I'll turn it back. Oh, Dr. Teagues.
I was just wondering, Lucas, about any efforts in lakes that you're aware of in the state. We're pretty focused on streams and rivers, but specifically inland lakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of similar to at least the ones that I'm aware of from a state perspective. Similar to what we have going on in streams and rivers, where we're sort of tapping into that existing capacity. Are through the Stats and Trends program, at least from the fish side, they also have a general invasive species protocol as well for when they visit lakes in addition to streams. So there's no formal surveys for them, but certainly always have their eyes out for invasive species, and if they come across them, they're reported. And then I'm aware of some EGLE surveys as well that similarly conduct some of those surveys at a statewide level, also targeting lakes. I think there's been about 100 or so over the last couple of years that does provide some additional level of capacity there to try to document any populations that might show up in the future in lake habitats.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Lucas, I can follow up on that a little bit. So yeah, Scott, we do a lot of inland lake surveys, 10 to 20 or so a year. I think we've done like 92 so far since 2014. We do look for invertebrates. We spend a lot of time, dip netting and snorkeling and with view chambers. So it's not specifically towards mud snails, but I think we would detect them if they were there in any abundance.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
No problem.
Any other questions from anybody? Okay, Jeremy, I think we're good to wrap up.
All right. Well, Lucas, thanks again for your talk, your presentation. Really great information to get us all up to speed about all the ongoing efforts happening in the context of this invasive mud snail. And for everybody who joined us today, thank you very much for participating. There are 3 more in the series, so keep an eye out for later announcements on the topics, dates, and times, etc. Again, feel free to reach out for any other information or questions that you may have following this webinar. Again, you can access this webinar after it will be recorded. It was recorded and will be available on our website, nzmscollaborative.org, as well as the previous webinars. And on the website, you also find a variety of different types of resources and information that should prove useful to you to quench your NZMS thirst and everything you'd like to know about them in the region that's ongoing. But in the meantime, everyone have a great day. Thanks again, Lucas, and everybody that attended.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Jazz.